Adam Broomberg, Ollie Chanarin. We're here in Freud's house. Why?
We're in Freud's study, actually. It's a very famous study. We were invited by the museum, alongside a lot of artists that they invite, to somehow respond to the museum and to come up with a project that can be housed here and somehow responds to its legacy and Freud's legacy. And we chose to concentrate on the iconic couch that's behind us, that every one of Freud's patients lay down upon, including the Wolfman and everybody we've all read about.
Freud actually died in this room, on a couch on the other side of the room. And there's just so much history in this room. There's such a kind of presence of this man, obviously. And we decided to make a work which is a sort of play on the word analysis. And we, as Adam said, we focused on his iconic couch. And we invited a group of forensic scientists who normally work with Scotland Yard. And they came into this room and they looked at it as a kind of crime scene. And they gathered DNA material from the couch. And we've gathered this material, which, as Adam mentioned, is the traces of all the various visitors that have visited upon this piece of furniture, including his iconic patients, but also tourists and analysts, and people come from all over the world to stand in this room and kind of imbibe the history.
I think we should explain exactly practically what we're doing. So our forensic scientists gathered every hair follicle or skin sample or anything they could find on the couch. They then took what it's called SEM images, so they blew them up, from 2,000 to 5,000 times. And they delivered those higher resolution images to us. And our kind of, the only gesture we made was, because the couch is famously covered in a Persian rug and has been throughout its active duty, and it measures 2 by 3 meters. We decided, instead of showing just photographs of this forensic evidence, but we sent those photographs to the best tapestry maker in the world, and they have re-rendered the results, the scientific results, as tapestries. And what we're going to do is place the tapestry, one of them, on top of the couch itself. And obviously it's very, vivid, bright colors, as you've seen those kind of images. And I think that juxtaposition, not only of a forensic science versus a different form that's here, also aesthetically, that the kind of jarring nature of it will be interesting.
It's interesting that you mention about the subjectivity of biography and the objectivity of science. Do you think we place too much emphasis or too much belief in the objectivity of science and the subjectivity of biography? We've now gone too far from believing that subjective experiences can be sort of valid to the person, and that science has come to dominate the way we think. We can't do anything that doesn't have a scientific basis.
I think as artists, what's lovely about being an artist is you're not beholden to that. We're not academics. We're not creating a thesis here, and our gesture can be a flawed one, and we're not gathering real scientific evidence. So the role of the artist is a very liberated one, because we're not beholden to the systems of science.
Why do you think artists still respond so strongly to Freud and Freud's legacy? He's been dead 75 years. A lot of his work, some's been, continued to have force and some's been discredited. Why is he still so influential?
He wasn't very interested in contemporary art, actually. And the surrealists really struggled with that, because, their entire thesis was based on psychoanalysis. But so it's interesting. It's kind of a one-way relationship. The art world is enamored by Freud, but he wasn't particularly interested in them.
Saying that, he reluctantly saw Salvador Dali and was very, very impressed by him after a long session with him. So I think that that's one exception to that rule. But I think Ollie's point's a very interesting one.
So what is it that artists like then? Is it that he opened up a whole range of sort of a whole irrational toolbox in some ways?
Oh, I don't know. It's such a massive question. I kind of have to really.
I think it's not just artists. I mean, recently I just reread one of the last lectures that Edward Said ever gave was given in this room, and it was thinking about or rethinking about Freud's last book, which was a meditation on the sources of Judaism and the fact that Moses wasn't actually a Jew, and that his doctrine came from the Egyptians. And how does Judaism cope with that its genesis wasn't in fact Jewish? And Freud found that so interesting, and Edward Said kind of reactivated the text and made it interesting for the political landscape that we're living in now. So I think his legacy, reaches in all these different areas, not just the art world.
They've got, if you go into the bookshop here, they've got a pair of slippers. They're called Freudian slippers. And I think, Freud was obviously interested in the things that we say that we don't mean to say. And I think as artists, our practice is really also about, what comes out without meaning to. And so, for example, we've done a lot of work with the British military and other armies. We're very interested in the kind of the idea of the state and the power, and the way that at times the state speaks and reveals things accidentally through its actions and through its words.
With the project Ollie was talking about, we got ourselves embedded with the British military in Helmand province during the height of the war in Afghanistan. And instead of taking a camera, we took just a roll of paper. And so what Ollie was talking about, this roll of the accident we're very interested in. So we went where ordinarily a photojournalist would be taken, where there was a site of a killing or a suicide bomb. And instead of taking a picture, we unrolled 6 meters of a section of paper and literally exposed it to light, and came back with an abstract, non-figurative piece that was recently shown in the Tate Modern in a show on conflict. And our meditation was, what do people actually expect of their witnesses? They're people who are acting on their behalf in these war zones. What do you expect? What is suitable evidence? What is scientific evidence of a death or of a psychoanalytical patient? And again, it was just a kind of setting up a kind of hypothesis and presenting it in a practical, physical form.
You've put yourself in positions where you probably enjoy it less. You've been to Afghanistan, for example. Must have been a really difficult experience.
It was very scary, but it was very enjoyable because it was interesting. I was very curious about how war works. We've all read about it our whole lives, but how does it actually work? What does it feel like? How does it function? And so, just out of curiosity, I was very satisfied by that experience. And also, it's quite humorous. War is quite, even though it was at the height of the insurgents, and we arrived during the most deaths that had happened during the war, people are laughing constantly. And the mundanity of it was very interesting. And the choreography and the logistics are so fascinating to watch.
That work, The Day That Nobody Died, was in this conflict time photography show at Tate Modern. And did you feel that it was that it sat well among the more documentary works that were there?
I mean, the history of photography is all about being in control. About timing and framing, and that's what it trades upon. And I think we, in our practice, are trying to reject all of that and leave it as much as possible up to accident. And the more the accident is in power, the better the work is, really.
The military have been an important part of your practice. Is it because you like this idea, as we mentioned earlier, about structures and maybe subversion of structures and routines and the rigmarole that goes with that, and the way that artists can see through it or undermine it?
It's interesting because when we went to Afghanistan with the British Army, we didn't tell them we were artists. We told them we were journalists. And that was really important because as journalists, I think they felt they could control us, that we'd signed up to something that made sense to them. The artist is a much more chaotic figure, a much less controllable entity. And I think that the idea of an artist in a war zone is a much more frightening place to an organization like the military.
But for example, our show that's opening in a couple of weeks at Lisson Gallery is also all about conflict, but we started tracing it back to the source, and we thought about the notion of autonomy, of when does a child whose birthright is autonomy, when do you surrender that to power? At what moment in life do you surrender it to authority? And we were reading a very interesting piece by a philosopher, German philosopher, who was educated during the Weimar Republic, and he tells a story about how he was at school and the head teacher said, "Which one of you boys wants to go and get me my stick today?" And all the little boys put up their hands and said, "Me, me, me." And he selected one, and the boy proudly ran off and brought back the stick. And the teacher said, "Now bend down," and whipped him. And the point of the story was that there was no logic to the punishment. It was just obedience to authority that was being imparted. And this philosopher suggested that possibly was one of the reasons why the Third Reich was able to come to power, because of the particular education system at that point, which was solely about obeying authority.
The way that we work is through kind of talking with each other and arguing and fighting and kind of making up, and it's a process that goes on a kind of journey where we kind of set off from one place and we don't really know where we're going to end up. And so this story of the bullets really kind of captured our imagination, because there seemed to be something quite hilarious about it. It's almost like a Tom and Jerry cartoon where you have two people shooting at each other and the bullets bang into each other and kind of mold. And, we started thinking about slapstick and about the performance of pain. And one of the kind of important central tenets of slapstick comedy is the idea of the double act. The Lawrence and Hardy, or, the fat one and the thin one and the stupid one and the clever one and and Adam and I have been working together for 20 years. And
which one's the stupid one? Which one's the clever one?
I'm the stupid one.
I'm the stupid one.
We're both the stupid one. And we're both getting fatter. But we're a kind of double act, and in a way we think about ourselves as a kind of, our collaboration is a bit of an accident. We sort of bumped into each other 20 years ago and we're still working together.
How do you think people should find their way into your work? If someone were looking at your work cold the first time, what would you suggest to them they start thinking about? What things would you say are good sort of, maybe keys? Maybe it's not the right word, but to your work.
I think I hope that it's not important to understand something. It's important to respond to it intuitively. So standing in front of one of these images of the fused bullets, you have a response to it immediately as an aesthetic object. And then there's a second layer, is when you understand what that object is, the meaning and the kind of emotional impact hopefully grows. So I think there's those two layers, is the one to appreciate an object existing in a space, and the other is when you're slightly informed about what it is, it grows.
We've also been thinking about humour in the gallery, in the kind of museum space. I think people don't laugh very much in museums and in galleries. There's a kind of, within the contemporary art world, humour is sort of, there's a kind of lack of humour in a lot of exhibitions, and there's a kind of protocol. And we set out to make a film for the show which we want hopefully to be humorous, and for people to go in there and for their response, at least their first response, to laugh. And I think that's the first achievement that we're hoping from the show, is that people find it funny.
Ollie often says this, and it's one of our kind of dictums, is that we're more interested in the real world than the art world.
How do you find operating in the art market today?
That's a really interesting question because, we started off as photographers and we were working very much in a photography mode, working with a large format camera in very traditional documentary sort of environments, photographing prisons and psychiatric hospitals and the sort of places that photographers like to visit. And we realized that we were operating in a kind of public art form that had very severe limitations. When we were publishing photographs in newspapers, it came with a whole lot of constraints that made it very difficult for us to say what we wanted to say and make the work we wanted to make. And the truth is that the art world is, for all its problems, is probably the most radical context that we can show our work. It's the freest environment with the least constraints, and for that reason, we feel like that's why we locate our work in the art world rather than in some other sphere.